They thought a quiet black girl in a restroom would be the easiest target of the week, but the moment their fists hit her, the universe shifted. In the cold, echoing tiles of Westlake High, those bullies learned a brutal truth. Some people don't cry. They detonate, their laughter snapped in half, their confidence shattered, and in less than 5 minutes, the hunting pack was begging on their knees for mercy they never deserved. What happened inside that restroom will make you rethink who the real threat was. The hallway of Westlake High roared like it always did during break, lockers slamming shut, sneakers squeaking, voices colliding into a messy wave of teenage noise. But something strange happened the moment Naira Caldwell stepped into that chaos. The noise didn't fade, it didn't pause, it shifted. Students didn't look at her directly, but their bodies reacted long before their minds did. Backs stiffening, shoulders tightening, feet sliding an inch to the side, as if an invisible force parted the hallway for her. It wasn't respect, it wasn't fear, it was instinct, the kind people feel around a storm before it breaks. Naira walked straight through the crowd, hoodie up, hands in her pockets, her steps quiet but grounded. She had been at Westlake for exactly 1 week, and in that week she had spoken maybe a dozen words to anyone. She didn't look around, didn't smile, didn't engage. She moved the way people move when they carry too much history and not enough desire to share it. From across the hallway, Rhett Carver, captain of the basketball team and self-appointed king of Westlake High, leaned against a locker with Sloane, his right-hand shadow. Rhett's eyes narrowed the moment he spotted Naira's silent path. "There she goes again," Sloane muttered, elbowing him. "Walking like she's too good to breathe the same air," Rhett scoffed, pushing himself off the locker with that arrogant, lazy strength he loved to display. "Nah, she's not acting tough." His eyes tracked her movements with growing irritation. "She's acting like we're invisible to boys like Rhett. Boys who thrived on being noticed, feared, or admired. Being ignored was the biggest insult of all. Naira didn't see them watching. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. She slipped past a group of freshmen who were too busy arguing to notice her approaching until one of them backed up suddenly and collided hard into Naira's shoulder. The boy jolted. His lunch bag hit the floor. "Ah, sorry, I didn't see." Naira didn't flinch, didn't twitch, didn't turn to him. She simply looked at him with eyes so empty, so unreadable, it was as if she wasn't looking at him at all, but through him, like he was a transparent object she had already calculated and dismissed. The boy froze, breath held, as if the air around her had dropped a few degrees, and just like that, Naira stepped around him and continued walking, the collision erased from her posture, her expression, her entire existence. A normal person would react. A normal person would wince, apologize, or at least blink. But Naira Caldwell did none of that. Rhett's eyebrows lifted, the corner of his mouth twisting into a dangerous smirk. "You saw that?" he muttered. Sloane nodded slowly. "Yeah, that girl's weird, man. Like a robot." Rhett didn't laugh. He didn't make a joke. His eyes sharpened the way a predator's does when it finds prey that looks wounded or defiant. "No," he said softly. "She's not a robot." He watched her disappear around the corner. She's exactly the kind of girl who needs a reminder of where she stands. To Rhett and Sloane, Naira's chilling lack of reaction wasn't confidence. It was a challenge, a silent dare, and to boys like them, that was all the permission they needed. A girl who doesn't react is always more threatening than one who fights back. But Rhett had no idea that her silence, the very thing that irritated him, would soon become the reason Westlake High would never forget her name. The cafeteria at Westlake High was a jungle at noon. Metallic clatter, gossip ricocheting off the walls, the smell of reheated pizza thick in the air. Yet beneath the ordinary chaos, a different kind of noise simmered. Rumors, whispers darted between tables like sparks. "That new girl? She didn't even blink when someone slammed into her. I swear she doesn't feel pain." "No, bro. She's just off. Creepy off." By the time Naira Caldwell stepped into the cafeteria with her tray, the rumor had evolved into a full-blown myth. The girl who doesn't know fear. It wasn't admiration. It was fascination sharpened into suspicion. Naira walked with that same unnerving stillness she carried in the hallways, head slightly bowed, eyes fixed forward, every step measured. Nothing about her demanded attention, yet attention followed her like a scent trail. At the center table, where only those with social authority sat, Rhett Carver lounged with his crew. Piper was beside him, legs crossed, sipping a bright red drink as she scanned the room like a queen surveying her territory. When she noticed the room shifting toward Naira, eyes tracking, whispers stirring, Piper raised an eyebrow. "What's the deal with her?" she asked, bored but intrigued. Rhett didn't even look up from his phone. "She thinks she's too good to react, too good to look scared," Sloane snorted. "She ain't scared of anything, apparently." That, finally, made Rhett lift his eyes. Nothing provoked him faster than someone not acknowledging his presence. He thrived on being the center of gravity, and the idea that some quiet new girl was stealing the cafeteria's attention without saying a word, that was unacceptable. Piper noticed the shift in his posture and smirked. "Want me to poke the bear?" Rhett leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. "Go ahead. Let's see if she bleeds." Piper stood with the elegance of someone who knew eyes followed her. She sauntered across the cafeteria, heels clicking lightly, until she stepped directly into Naira's path. Naira stopped, not abruptly, just enough to avoid colliding, and looked up at Piper with that same flat, unreadable gaze. No challenge, no submission, just silence. Piper smiled sweetly. "Oops!" She lifted her cup and dumped the entire red drink across the nearest table, letting it splash across Naira's tray and drip to the floor. The cafeteria inhaled sharply as one. Naira stared at the spreading liquid, bright red like a wound opening across the table's surface. No gasp, no frown, no stiffening. She simply set her tray down, picked up a handful of napkins, and began cleaning the spill with slow, methodical movements, as if Piper hadn't just humiliated her in front of the entire cafeteria. Piper blinked, thrown off. This wasn't how the game worked. People were supposed to cry, get angry, panic, something. But Naira finished wiping the table, tossed the soaked napkins into the trash, picked up what remained of her lunch, and walked away without a word. No fear, no frustration, no reaction, just emptiness. Across the cafeteria, Rhett watched, jaw flexing, eyes narrowing with something darker than irritation. "She ignored you," Sloane muttered. "No," Rhett said quietly, leaning forward. "She ignored me. And that, for a boy like Rhett Carver, was the ultimate insult. Silence is the most dangerous slap, because it stings without leaving a mark, and that silent slap pushed Rhett to make a decision. If Naira wouldn't acknowledge him willingly, he would force her to. The locker room after fourth period was humid with the smell of sweat, cheap cologne, and echoing voices bouncing off metal lockers. It was the place where Westlake's athletes bragged, plotted, and inflated their egos, and today it was where a plan began to rot. Rhett Carver slammed his locker shut with a metallic crack that made Sloane and Maddox jolt. "We're settling this today," he muttered, jaw tight. Maddox grinned, slinging his backpack onto the bench. "About time. I thought you were going to let the ghost girl walk all over you." Rhett shot him a glare sharp enough to slice steel. "Nobody walks over me." Sloane tossed a basketball from hand to hand, nodding. "So what's the move?" Rhett leaned against the lockers, lowering his voice to a dangerous calm. "We corner her in the East Wing restroom. No cameras, no teachers, no crowd." Maddox smirked. "Perfect. Freak girl won't know what hit her." But Piper, who had slipped into the locker room unnoticed, crossing her arms beside the doorway, didn't look amused. "You boys are idiots," she said flatly. Sloane rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go." Piper ignored him and addressed Rhett directly. "You shouldn't push her like that. There's something off about the girl. I dumped an entire drink on her, and she didn't even blink. Not a flinch, not a twitch. Nothing." Maddox snorted. Maybe she's just stupid. No, Piper shook her head. It wasn't that. It was like she's used to it. For a moment, the locker room went strangely quiet, as if everyone had swallowed the same uneasy thought. Then Rhett laughed, a low, humorless sound. "You want to know what's really weird?" he said slowly, glancing at each of them. "I saw her last Friday, after practice." Sloane frowned. "So?" It was raining, pouring. Rhett's voice dropped lower. "And she was standing in the courtyard outside the gym. No umbrella, no hood, just standing there." Maddox chuckled. "Okay, lots of people stand in the rain. Not for 30 minutes, Rhett snapped. The laughter stopped. Rhett's eyes darkened as he continued. "Lightning hit so close the ground shook. Everyone else ran inside, but Naira, she didn't move, didn't wipe the water from her face, didn't even shiver. She just stood there with this blank expression, like the storm couldn't touch her." Piper's face paled. Sloane muttered, "That's not normal, man." "Exactly." Rhett leaned forward, voice tightening with something between fear and pride. "That girl isn't fearless. She's numb, and people who feel nothing," he paused, "they're dangerous if you let them think they're untouchable." That single sentence changed the temperature in the room. The boys straightened, their grins sharpening into something uglier, no longer simple mischief, but a desire to crack whatever armor Naira wore, to prove control, to crush what they didn't understand. Piper exhaled sharply. "Rhett, maybe this is a bad idea." "No," Rhett cut her off. "This isn't about fun anymore. She thinks she doesn't have to react to anything? Wrong. Today she reacts." Maddox punched Sloane's shoulder. "Let's teach the robot a lesson." Piper watched them with growing dread, not because she cared for Naira, but because for the first time she saw fear flicker behind Rhett's bravado. When a bully is scared before the fight even starts, the outcome is never what they expect. But none of them backed out. This wasn't just a prank anymore. It was an ego-driven ambush, fueled by fear disguised as confidence. When a bully feels fear before the attack, the story always twists in the worst way. Yet despite every warning sign, they moved forward, and that was the first mistake that would ruin everything. The B-Wing hallway always felt colder than the rest of Westlake High, narrower, dimmer, the kind of place where fluorescent lights flickered just a little too slowly and footsteps echoed a little too loudly. Most students avoided it unless they absolutely had to use the restroom there. Today, it was empty, deliberately empty. Naira's sneakers brushed quietly along the faded tiles as she walked, her gaze low, her pace unchanging. She wasn't headed toward the restroom at all, but the universe, or someone playing God, didn't intend to let her leave the hallway untouched. "Naira, wait, please." The desperate tremble in the voice made Naira halt mid-step. She turned just enough to see Piper half jogging toward her, clutching her backpack strap as if she were genuinely distressed. Her face was flushed, eyes wide, breath shaking. It was a convincing performance. "Can you help me?" Piper whispered, leaning in as though afraid someone might overhear. "Something's wrong with the faucet in the restroom. It's spraying everywhere. I just need another girl to look, please." Naira blinked once. No suspicion, no concern, just a calm that made Piper swallow hard for a split second before pulling herself together. Naira nodded lightly and followed. They stepped inside the restroom. The echo of the door closing behind them felt final, too final. Naira didn't flinch, but she did glance briefly at the mirror, where she caught the reflection of Sloane slipping into place behind her, blocking the door with a grin far too self-satisfied. The trap snapped shut. Piper's demeanor changed instantly. The urgency melted off her face, replaced with a smirk that curled with cruel confidence. She no longer looked like a girl needing help. She looked like a girl who enjoyed the show she was about to stage. "Sorry, sweetheart," Piper said sweetly, "but you really shouldn't have ignored us." And before Naira could take another step, Piper gave her a shove, sharp, calculated, sending her stumbling into the nearest restroom stall. The metal door rattled on its hinges as Naira caught herself on the divider. Sloane chuckled behind her. "Nice one." Nira slowly straightened, her hands relaxing at her sides. No fear, no anger, not even surprise. Her breathing didn't change. Her posture didn't stiffen. She simply stood there inside the narrow metal box, looking at Piper and Sloane with the same emptiness that had followed her all week. Piper folded her arms, leaning against the sink counter. "Not so quiet now, huh? Or are you gonna keep pretending you're too good to talk to anybody?" Naira tilted her head slightly, as though she were studying something trivial. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, too soft, almost gentle. "You're sure you want to do this?" The words weren't a threat. They weren't a plea. They were a question, a calm, sincere question, and that was what made it terrifying. Piper's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat. A subtle shiver of instinct told her something wasn't right. This wasn't the reaction she expected. This wasn't the fear she came to provoke. Sloane scoffed loudly, stepping forward to mask the crack in confidence. Look at her, trying to sound scary, but the damage was already done. Naira's warning wasn't barked, wasn't yelled, wasn't laced with panic. It was spoken in a voice so steady, so unbothered, that it felt like a prophecy. One Sloane and Piper were too arrogant to heed. Nira stepped once to the side, her foot silent against the tile. Piper straightened, annoyed by the whisper of doubt sneaking up her spine. "Oh, please," she sneered, "drop the act. You're trapped." The most terrifying warning is the one spoken in a calm voice, and they would have kept laughing until the sound of heavy footsteps approached, and Rhett Carver finally appeared at the doorway. The restroom's harsh white lights washed everything in an unforgiving glow, every crack in the tiles, every trembling breath, every shadow sharpened into something colder than it needed to be. Piper and Sloane straightened the moment the footsteps reached the doorway, and then Rhett Carver stepped in, filling the room with a presence that vacuumed the air clean out of it. He scanned the scene, Naira standing silently inside the stall doorway, Piper smirking, arms crossed, Sloane blocking the exit, Maddox slipping in behind Rhett with his phone already in his hand, ready to record. Rhett's lips curled into a slow, venomous grin. "Well, well," he said. "Looks like our little ghost finally talks back." Naira didn't answer. Her stillness wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, older, carved from places no one in that restroom had ever been. That only irritated Rhett more. With two long strides, he closed the distance between them. Before Piper or Sloane could blink, Rhett grabbed Naira by the collar of her hoodie and slammed her backward. Her head struck the cold tile wall with a dull, sickening thud. For the first time, sound entered the silence, a soft breath escaping Naira's lips as her skull met cement. A tiny smear of red gathered at the corner of her mouth, bright against the pale school lighting. Piper smirked. Sloane laughed. Maddox lifted his phone higher. "There it is," Rhett taunted. A reaction. Naira didn't lift her hands to protect herself, didn't push him away, didn't resist. Her arms hung loose at her sides, relaxed, as if her body already knew the impact, already understood the rhythm of pain. Rhett tightened his grip, expecting fear, shaking, pleading, something he could savor. But when Naira lifted her gaze to meet his, the entire room shifted. Her eyes were not wide with panic, not burning with anger, not clouded with humiliation. They were clear, steady, awake, and in that clarity was something far more chilling than any outburst. Familiarity, as if what he'd just done wasn't shocking or new, as if it was a scene she had lived 1,000 times before, as if this pain was routine. Her lips parted just enough for a tiny drop of blood to trace her chin, but her expression didn't change, not even a flinch. Piper's smile faltered. Sloane stopped laughing. Even Maddox lowered his phone a fraction. Rhett felt something he had never felt in a fight before, a split-second flicker of uncertainty. "What are you staring at?" he snapped, shaking her once by the collar. Nira blinked, slow, deliberate, almost gentle. It wasn't surrender, it wasn't defiance, it was acceptance. quiet and practiced, like she'd learned long ago that resisting only fed the monster. Rhett didn't break something inside her. He exposed something, a truth buried beneath her silence. Nira wasn't fearless. She was used to pain, and a person accustomed to suffering is far more dangerous than one who fears it. Nira finally spoke, voice low and steady as a heartbeat. "You should stop now." The words weren't a threat. They weren't desperate. They were an observation, a warning shaped by experience, not emotion. The kind of warning that comes from someone who knows exactly what happens next, because they've already survived worse. There's nothing more terrifying than someone who has learned to endure violence like breathing. And Rhett, blinded by ego, was about to cross the one line Nira could no longer allow anyone to cross. The restroom stall felt even smaller now. Walls closing in, air tightening, the white light buzzing overhead like a warning. Rhett still had one fist twisted in Nira's collar, but something in her eyes, too calm, too accepting, gnawed at a place he didn't want to acknowledge. So he reacted the way bullies always do when challenged by something they don't understand. He struck harder. With a grunt of frustrated rage, Rhett shoved her backward and drove his foot into her stomach, sending Nira crashing to the tile floor. The impact echoed, sharp, violent, final. Sloane burst out laughing. Piper smirked, though something uneasy flickered behind her eyes. And Maddox? He raised his phone higher, whispering, "This is gold." Nira lay on her side, one arm curled slightly under her, breath leaving her lungs in a soft exhale. To the group, it looked like victory, like the untouchable new girl had finally broken. Rhett wiped his hands together. "See? Nothing special." But before Sloane could deliver another joke, before Piper could flip her hair and mock the moment, before Maddox could zoom in for a better shot, Nira moved, not slowly, not shakily, not like someone recovering from being kicked. She sprung, a blur, clean, silent, impossible to track with the human eye. 1 second she was on the floor, the next she was directly in front of Maddox, her hand snapping around his wrist with a precision no untrained person could pull off. "What?" Maddox gasped, but the sound choked off. With a single fluid motion, Nira twisted his arm, pivoted her body, and sent him flying over her shoulder. His phone clattered across the tile. His back slammed into the floor so hard the sinks trembled. The entire room froze. Maddox groaned, clutching his ribs. The air punched clean out of him. The clip he tried to film now recorded nothing but the ceiling. Sloane's laughter died mid-breath. Piper's lips parted in shock. Even Rhett, who never backed down from anything, took half a step backward. "What the hell?" he muttered. Nira stood completely still, posture relaxed, breathing steady. Her expression hadn't changed. No rage, no adrenaline, no trembling hands, just clarity. Silence suffocated the restroom, thick enough to drown in. Rhett swallowed hard, eyes darting to Maddox's crumpled form. How did you do that?" Nira didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her body had spoken for her. Every movement had been too sharp, too efficient, too practiced to be accidental. It wasn't random instinct. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't luck. It was training. Serious training. Combat training. Sloane's voice cracked. "Dude, she moved like some kind of—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. Nira Caldwell wasn't the fragile, quiet, strange new girl they thought she was. She wasn't numb because she lacked fear. She was numb because she'd been hardened, shaped by environments none of them could imagine. They hadn't cornered a harmless outsider. They had cornered someone who had survived worse threats than them, and learned exactly how to take them apart. Piper backed up toward the sinks, hands trembling slightly. "That wasn't normal," she whispered. "No one moves like that." Nira's gaze swept across them. Slow, steady, weighing, calculating. Not choosing whether to fight, but whether she needed to. Rhett clenched his fists, trying to gather the scraps of his shattered confidence. "She just got lucky," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice exposed the truth. Because in a single second, the entire ecosystem of power inside that restroom had shifted. The hunters were no longer hunting. The prey was no longer prey, and nobody was prepared for what would happen next. 1 second is all it takes to rewrite the hierarchy of power. And this was only the beginning of Naira's response. The restroom felt smaller now, its walls shrinking inward, trapping the air like a sealed vault. The buzzing ventilation fan overhead rattled unevenly, its metallic whine slicing through the heavy silence that followed Maddox's collapse. Maddox was still on the floor, curled around the shock of his own body, failing him. Piper hovered beside the sinks, torn between stepping forward and sprinting for the door. Sloane pressed himself against the far wall, pale under the harsh lighting, and Naira Caldwell stood in the center of it all, motionless, calm, waiting. Sloane was the first to crack. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he barked, voice pitching too high for confidence. "You think you can just throw people like that and walk away?" His words trembled, and everyone could hear it. He slapped his palms against his thighs, trying to fire himself up, trying to convince not Naira, but himself. "She ain't scary," he muttered under his breath. "She ain't," but he couldn't finish. Fear strangled the last syllable. Out of desperation, out of ego, Sloane lunged. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't planned. It was the kind of charge someone makes when they believe they're running toward salvation, but are actually sprinting into disaster. Naira didn't lift her hands, didn't prepare a stance, didn't brace for impact. She simply stepped aside. That single effortless pivot rerouted Sloane's entire momentum, and, before he could stop himself, he slammed shoulder first into the tiled wall. The thud shook the mirrors. Sloane's forehead clipped the edge of the paper towel dispenser, splitting skin. Blood streaked down his brow as he slid to his knees, groaning. Piper gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Rhett, for the first time since entering the restroom, stopped breathing. His eyes darted from Sloane, clutching his head, to Maddox, still wheezing on the floor, to Naira, who hadn't laid a single intentional hand on anyone besides the boy who tried to film her. She didn't even touch him, Piper whispered, voice cracking. And it was true. Naira hadn't attacked. She had only moved. Rhett's hands trembled at his sides, a flicker of panic breaking through his practiced swagger. What is she?" Naira looked at him then, not threateningly, not coldly, but with a calm so complete it felt like a verdict. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She simply existed in the eye of a storm none of them understood. That terrified them more than any punch could have. Piper swallowed hard, her mind spiraling. Should she run? Should she help Rhett? Should she pretend none of this was happening? Every instinct pushed her in a different direction, tearing her in half. "Rhett," she whispered, "stop this. Something's wrong. We need to—" "No." Rhett cut her off sharply, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He couldn't tear his gaze from Naira. Naira wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't sweating. She wasn't even defensive. She just stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands loose at her sides, as if the carnage around her had nothing to do with her. And somehow that stillness was more violent than anything she'd done. Because real power doesn't need to swing. Real power doesn't need to shout. Real power simply stands, and the world rearranges itself around it. Sloane whimpered softly, wiping blood from his brow. Maddox groaned again. Piper backed farther toward the wall. And Rhett? For the first time since stepping foot in Westlake High, Rhett Carver had no idea what to do. The truly powerful don't have to strike. They only have to stand still, and everything else collapses. Drowning in fear he refused to admit, Rhett made the most reckless decision of his life. The restroom floor had turned slick, glossy patches of disinfectant spray glimmering under the cold fluorescent lights. The air reeked of chemicals and panic. Sloane was still bleeding from the forehead. Maddox lay groaning on the tiles. Piper trembled near the sinks, torn between instinct and loyalty. And standing in the center, framed by chaos, was Naira, silent, steady, unmoved. Rhett couldn't take it any more. He needed control back. He needed the room to obey him again. He needed the fear to move away from him, not toward him. So he did the stupidest thing a cornered alpha could do. He reached for a weapon. His hand shot toward the janitor's closet beside the stalls, ripping out a long wooden mop handle with the dried mop head still attached. Sloane flinched at the sound of it cracking against the doorframe. "Back off!" Rhett barked, though Naira hadn't moved an inch. His voice came out too loud, too desperate. "You think you're tough? You think you can scare me?" He swung the mop wildly, wide, reckless arcs that cut through the air with frantic speed. Piper screamed. "Rhett, stop! You're going to hurt someone!" That was the point. He didn't care who. Anything to prove he was still in charge. Rhett lunged forward, bringing the mop down in a sharp diagonal slash toward Neera's shoulder. But Neera simply shifted, just a half step, barely noticeable, a motion so small it looked like she was just changing her balance. The mop whooshed past her and struck Sloane directly in the ribs. The sound was brutal, a hollow, sickening thump. Sloane screamed, collapsing onto his side, curling around himself as tears streamed down his face. His breathing came in ragged, panicked gasps. "Rhett! Rhett! You idiot! You hit me! You hit me!" Rhett's eyes widened, pulse skittering out of control. He hadn't meant to hit Sloane. He hadn't meant to expose how wildly he'd lost control. He hadn't meant to show the cracks in his confidence. But the truth spilled out in front of everyone. Piper stared at him, horrified. "What is wrong with you?" Rhett gripped the mop handle tighter, knuckles pale, trying to steady his trembling hands. He aimed the next swing at Naira, but even he could see his own motions unraveling. Too slow, too sloppy, too panicked, because Naira wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. She wasn't scared. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even preparing to defend herself. She was watching him, studying him, and in her eyes, Rhett saw it, the thing that terrified him more than her strength. She didn't see him as a threat. Rhett's breath hitched. Sloane sobbed on the floor, clutching his ribs. Piper backed against the sinks, shaking. Maddox groaned, still unable to stand. For the first time in his life, Rhett wasn't the one controlling the room. He was losing it, grasping for dominance that no longer belonged to him, swinging a weapon he could barely hold steady, hurting his own teammates instead of the girl he'd set out to intimidate. Rhett's unraveling exposed a truth the whole group had felt but never spoken. He wasn't the real leader. He just acted like one until pressure revealed the cracks, and now those cracks were splitting wide open. Neera stepped back, not out of fear, but out of calculated restraint. Standing still, she radiated a control Rhett had never possessed. Piper's voice trembled. "She's not the problem, Rhett. You are." The mop handle lowered slightly. Rhett's breath shook, because deep down, even he knew it was true. When the leader starts to fear, the entire pack collapses, and this fracture, this single, undeniable moment of weakness, would become the opening for their complete downfall. Piper had seen enough. The bruising thud of Sloane hitting the wall, Maddox crumpled on the tiles, Rhett swinging like a rabid animal. None of it made sense anymore. The restroom felt cursed, charged with something feral and wrong. Her instincts, sharper than she wanted to admit, finally screamed at her, "Run!" She bolted out the door, shoes slapping against the hallway floor. Panic clawed at her lungs. She didn't care how it looked. She just needed distance, needed air, needed safety. But she didn't get far. 3 steps into the hallway, a sharp guttural sound echoed behind her. A sound she'd never heard Rhett make, a sound of pain. Piper froze mid-stride, her pulse hammered in her throat. She turned her head slowly, dread creeping up her spine like cold vines. Inside the restroom, Rhett staggered forward, mop handle abandoned, teeth clenched. Even from the doorway, Piper could see it. Humiliation staining his face, fear cracking through his composure. He roared, a desperate, broken sound, and charged Neera again. But Naira didn't move backward. She moved forward. Her hand snatched Rhett's wrist mid-swing, thumb pressing into the exact nerve that weakened his grip. Before he could react, Naira pivoted, pulling him across her hip and throwing him flat onto the tile with a technique so clean, so precise, so unmistakably professional that Piper's jaw dropped. This wasn't a flinch. This wasn't survival reflex. This wasn't luck. This was training. Rhett hit the floor with a brutal, breath-stealing thud. The whole restroom shook. Piper's hand flew to her mouth as recognition slammed into her like a truck. No, 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 no. She had seen that move before, not in person. In a video, a viral clip used in fundraisers. A girl, quiet, serious, with the same sharp stillness as Naira, demonstrating takedowns in the Girls' Self-Defense Scholarship Program. The program specifically designed for girls who had survived violent homes, dangerous neighborhoods, abusive relatives, girls who needed not just protection, but training, girls who had lived through things that never should have happened, girls who learned to fight because the world had already fought them first. Piper remembered the comments under that video. "This kid moves like she's been doing this her whole life. She isn't just practicing, she's remembering." Slowly, piecing the memory together, Piper whispered, "Neera, you're her. The girl from the video." Everything snapped into place. Neera's emptiness, her stillness, her numb, unblinking reaction to pain, her near-supernatural reflexes, her ability to dismantle Rhett in seconds. Neera wasn't a mystery. She was a survivor, a girl shaped, sharpened, and scarred by things far worse than high school bullies. The realization hit Piper with the force of a falling building. She staggered backward against the hallway wall, staring into the restroom with wide, horrified eyes. Because suddenly, this wasn't a prank gone wrong. This wasn't schoolyard intimidation spiraling out of control. This was a group of privileged teenagers provoking someone who had already lived through hell and come out trained, disciplined, and dangerous. Piper whispered, voice trembling, "We didn't corner a victim. We cornered a soldier." Inside the restroom, Naira stepped back, giving Rhett room to breathe. Not out of mercy, but out of control. She wasn't attacking. She was allowing him to choose what happened next. And Rhett, gasping on the floor, realized he no longer had choices. Piper wasn't terrified of Naira's strength. She was terrified of what created it. Because sometimes you don't bully a person. You bully a history forged in fire. Sometimes the person you try to break is someone who has already been rebuilt by flames. And with the truth exposed, the bully's prank twisted into a nightmare none of them were prepared for. The floor of the restroom was cold enough to sting. The harsh white lights overhead painted everything in a sterile, cruel brightness. No shadows to soften what was unfolding, no darkness to hide behind. Every flaw, every bruise, every tremor was illuminated. Rhett Carver lay sprawled on the tiles, gasping for breath as he tried to force strength back into his limbs. His pride had taken the first hit. His ribs had taken the second. But his ego, once untouchable, once worshipped, was crumbling fastest of all. He wasn't used to losing. He wasn't used to fear. He wasn't used to being the one looking up. He reached out blindly, fingers clawing at the floor as he tried to grab Naira's ankle. Maybe he thought he could still win. Maybe he thought he could still save face. But Naira moved before he could even wrap his hand around her. Not with rage, not with panic, not with adrenaline, with precision. She spun, one controlled, fluid turn, and her heel pressed firmly onto Rhett's back, right between his shoulder blades. Her weight shifted smoothly, pinning him down without harshness. It was technique, not brutality. She didn't stomp, she grounded him. Rhett's breath exploded out of him in a shocked grunt. "What? Get off!" His voice cracked into something smaller. Roar. Naira didn't reply. She lowered herself slightly, grabbing his arm with practiced efficiency. In one swift movement, she folded his wrist back and locked it against his spine, a textbook joint immobilization. Rhett's face smashed into the tile, cheek scraping painfully against the gritty surface. His cry echoed sharp and helpless through the restroom. "Stop! Stop! My arm!" I said, "Stop!" But Naira held him steady, not twisting harder, not hurting him further, just neutralizing him. She controlled the exact amount of pressure needed to keep him down without causing permanent damage. Her mastery made it even more terrifying. From the hallway, Piper stood frozen, half hidden behind the doorframe, hands trembling at her mouth. She had seen Rhett fight dozens of times. He was the strongest guy on the basketball team, a powerhouse, the one nobody dared to challenge. And now? He lay under Naira like a child being scolded. His muscles, usually taut with swagger, shook as he tried to free himself. His sneakers squeaked uselessly against the tile. His pride shattered with every second he remained pinned. The most unsettling part wasn't the speed of Naira's movements or the efficiency of her takedown, or even the way Rhett's face twisted in panic. It was the silence. Naira didn't roar, didn't insult him, didn't celebrate. Her expression was calm, breathing steady, eyes distant, as if her mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere familiar, somewhere she had been before, and that quiet mastery made the victory feel heavier, colder, inescapable. Piper whispered, "Oh my God!" Her voice cracked, because realization finally hit her with full force. Naira wasn't the weak, strange outsider they'd mocked. She wasn't someone they could break for fun. She wasn't even someone playing defense. She was someone who had survived battles long before this one, someone forged by environments far darker than a school restroom. Someone dangerous not because she wanted to be, but because she had to be. Rhett whimpered again, trying to lift his head, only for Naira's knee to gently nudge his wrist back into place. "Stop fighting," she said softly. "Not cruel, not taunting, simply instructive." That broke him more than the hold, because a leader, a tyrant, a bully, being spoken to like a misbehaving child was a humiliation beyond anything physical. In that moment, Rhett wasn't the aggressor. He wasn't the king of the school. He wasn't feared. He was defeated. Every cruel empire collapses not with a scream, but with a quiet pinning of the knee. But the consequences of this moment would ripple far beyond the restroom walls, into classrooms, hallways, and the entire hierarchy of Westlake High. The hallway outside the restroom was eerily quiet. Too quiet for a school buzzing with end-of-period chatter. That silence was exactly what caught Miss Harlan's attention as she rounded the corner, clipboard in hand. Then came the muffled thud, a cry, something crashing against tile. Her instincts sharpened instantly. She sprinted. By the time she reached the B-wing restroom, Piper was already outside, pale and trembling, back pressed against the wall like she couldn't decide whether to flee or faint. The girl's chest rose and fell in frantic bursts, mascara smudged from the panic. "Piper, what's happening?" Ms. Harlan demanded. Piper opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted everywhere except inside the restroom. Words tangled in her throat. Fear? Guilt? Confusion? Even she couldn't tell. I, Piper stuttered. It got bad. I mean, we didn't think." Before she could finish, Rhett Carver staggered into view, leaning against the restroom doorframe. His face was flushed, hair disheveled, pride shattered. One arm hung stiff from the joint lock Naira had forced him into. He looked injured. He looked humiliated. He looked desperate. "Ms. Harland," he gasped, pointing back toward the restroom. "You need to call security. She's insane. She attacked us." Ms. Harland stiffened. "Who?" "Naira," Rhett snapped. "She started it. She jumped us out of nowhere." Behind him, Sloane limped forward, still holding a wad of paper towels to his bleeding forehead. He played his part with disgusting ease. "She's crazy," Sloane mumbled. "We were just talking to her and she flipped." went full psycho. The hallway air thickened with lies. Piper's mouth fell open slightly, shocked that they could twist the truth so quickly, so convincingly. But she didn't speak. Fear sealed her lips shut. Inside the restroom, Neera emerged slowly, walking, calm, her hoodie slightly torn, a faint trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. Her expression was unreadable, neither defensive nor angry, just steady, the kind of steadiness that made people uncomfortable. "Neera," Miss Harland said, scanning her face. "What happened in there?" Neera didn't answer. She didn't point at Rhett. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. Her silence, once a shield, now became a weapon used against her. Rhett seized the moment. "See? She won't talk. She knows she's guilty," Sloane added quickly. "She threw Maddox first. Then she came after me and Rhett. We didn't do anything." Miss Harland looked between the boys, injured, shaken, and the quiet girl who refused to speak. To an outsider, the conclusion was painfully easy to draw. Neera stood still, hands at her sides, her gaze soft but far away, as if she didn't care what they said, as if she'd heard worse accusations in other lifetimes. And that silence, that maddening, resolute silence, tilted the entire situation in the bullies' favor. In the real world, the loudest voice wins, no matter how false their story is. But none of them realized someone else had been inside that restroom the entire time, watching everything unfold. For a brief moment, the hallway froze. Accusations hanging in the air, tension crackling like static. Rhett clutched his injured arm. Sloane pressed paper towels to his bleeding forehead, and Neera stood silent yet steady, absorbing their lies without a flicker of emotion. Miss Harland frowned, torn between the loud story and the quiet girl who refused to defend herself. Then a sound, a small creak. All heads turned toward the restroom. From the last stall, the door eased open, hinges groaning like they, too, were reluctant to speak. And out stepped Zion Walker, a skinny sophomore with curly hair, oversized glasses, and a backpack that always looked heavier than he was, normally invisible, normally ignored. The kind of kid who blended into walls, but right now, every eye snapped to him. His face was pale. His hands shook. He clutched the strap of his backpack like a lifeline. Zion had clearly been hiding in the stall long before the fight started, trying to avoid a group of boys who often shoved him around between classes. He hadn't meant to witness anything, but he had, and he had heard everything. Miss Harland's eyebrows shot up. "Zion, were you in there the whole time?" Zion nodded, swallowing hard. His voice wavered. "Yes, ma'am." Rhett stiffened. Sloane's face drained of color. Piper took one involuntary step back. Zion looked at Neera first, really looked, and his shoulders settled, as though choosing which side truth belonged to. I saw what happened," he said quietly. Miss Harland leaned closer. "Go on," Zion inhaled shakily. "Rhett and Sloane, they were already in the restroom. They were waiting." Then Piper brought Neera in. They surrounded her. His voice steadied with each word. Rhett pushed her first. Piper's breath caught. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. They all tried to attack her. Zion continued, eyes darting to Rhett and Sloane. "She didn't start anything." "They did," Sloane sputtered. "He's lying. He's lying for her." But the panic in his voice betrayed him. Zion shook his head, fear replaced by something firmer, something brave. "No, I'm not lying. I saw Maddox try to film it. I saw Rhett shove her into the wall. I saw everything." Piper wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the floor, unable to contradict him, because she knew Zion was telling the truth, and deep down, she knew the truth was about to swallow them all. Rhett's jaw clenched so hard a vein pulsed at his temple. His bravado cracked, replaced by something raw and ugly. Fear of exposure, fear of consequences, fear of losing the empire he'd built on intimidation. "Zion," Rhett hissed. "Shut your mouth." But Zion didn't. For the first time he stood straighter, taller even. "No, Neera didn't attack you. You all attacked her. Ms. Harlan's eyes sharpened. The puzzle pieces shifted. Doubt crept into her posture. Doubt aimed at the boys who had always manipulated the narrative. "Rhett," she said slowly, "is that true?" Rhett opened his mouth, desperate to salvage his story, but Ms. Harlan had already seen the fear in his eyes. Piper squeezed her eyes shut. Sloane winced. The deception was unraveling. Truth always emerges from the places no one thinks to look, but Zion's revelation was only the beginning, because the next piece of evidence would tear the lie wide open. The security office at Westlake High was always dim, walls lined with glowing monitors, each flickering with grainy hallway footage. It felt more like a control room than part of a school, humming with quiet authority. Today, it also hummed with tension. Miss Harland stood with her arms folded, gaze fixed on Piper, who sat stiffly in a plastic chair. Neera stood off to the side, her posture as calm and unreadable as ever, eyes lowered to the floor. Piper looked nothing like the queen bee persona she wore in the cafeteria. Her eyeliner had smudged from stress, and her fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve until the fabric wrinkled. Guilt clung to her like a heavy coat. "I need to show you something," Piper whispered, finally breaking the silence. She reached into her pocket, pulling out Maddox's cracked phone, the one he dropped when Neera flipped him. The case was dented, the screen fractured like spider webs, but the device still worked. Ms. Harland raised a brow. "What is that?" Piper's voice trembled. "A video Maddox was recording in the restroom before everything got bad." Neera didn't look up, not even at the mention of evidence. Her breath remained slow, steady. Her silence wasn't defiance. It was endurance. Piper unlocked the phone, opened the gallery, and held it out for Ms. Harland. The video began abruptly. Shaky footage, Maddox laughing into the camera before flipping it toward the restroom. The angle was crooked, the lighting harsh, but what it captured was enough. Rhett's voice, Sloane's taunts, Piper's shove, and then, clear as daylight, Rhett grabbing Neera and slamming her into the wall. Neera's head hit the tile. The sound echoed through the tiny security room. Ms. Harland flinched. The video cut off when Maddox's arm jerked, right before she flipped him. But the crucial truth was already recorded. Neera never attacked first. Rhett did. Piper swallowed hard. I didn't want to be part of this anymore. I didn't think it would go that far. And when I saw Zion come out, I knew we couldn't keep lying." She glanced at Neera, guilt softening her voice. "She didn't do anything wrong." Ms. Harland exhaled slowly, the kind of breath adults take when they realize they have misjudged a child. She replayed the impact again, watching the moment of violence frame by frame. Neera still stood in silence. No shaking hands, no trembling lips, no pleas for justice. She endured the accusation the same way she endured the hit, quietly, without asking for protection. That silence broke Ms. Harland's heart. "You should have said something," Ms. Harland whispered, eyes softening. Neera finally looked up. Her eyes held a depth that belonged to someone who had learned long ago that adults don't always listen. Someone who expected to fight alone. "I didn't think it would matter," she said, soft, steady, and somehow that single sentence felt heavier than every scream in the hallway. Ms. Harland pressed her lips together and nodded firmly. "It matters now." Piper lowered her head in shame. "Violence can be hidden, lies can be rehearsed, but a camera never forgets what it sees. Yet even with the truth revealed, the consequences for the bullies were far from over. The real reckoning hadn't even begun. The disciplinary boardroom at Westlake High was designed to intimidate. Long oak table, black leather chairs, a wall lined with framed certificates and polished plaques. But today, none of that authority felt nearly as heavy as the silence filling the room. On one side sat Neera Caldwell and her mother, Ms. Caldwell, a woman with tired eyes and a quiet strength etched into the lines of her face. On the other side sat Rhett Carver, flanked by his parents. Mr. Carver, a businessman whose handshake was legendary, and Mrs. Carver, whose smile never reached her eyes. In the middle, members of the school board waited with folded hands, tablets open, the grainy but undeniable restroom footage cued and ready. Rhett shifted in his seat, bandaged wrist resting on the table. His bruised ego throbbed louder than any injury on his body. He refused to meet Neera's gaze. Mr. Carver was the first to speak, leaning forward with a polished smile. "My son would never attack someone without provocation. Rhett has always been a leader, a good kid. If he reacted, it was because this girl," he gestured vaguely toward Neera, "must have triggered him somehow." Mrs. Carver chimed in quickly, tossing her hair. "Teenage girls can be dramatic. Maybe she misunderstood his intentions, or maybe she overreacted." Neera sat still, hands folded neatly in her lap. Before the board could respond, Miss Caldwell placed a gentle hand on her daughter's knee. Her voice, when she spoke, trembled only slightly, but held strength beneath it. "My daughter doesn't overreact, Mrs. Carver," she inhaled. "She survives." The room stilled. Miss Caldwell continued, "Neera grew up in a home where shouting came before dinner and fists came before apologies. When I got her out of that house, the therapist recommended a self-defense program, not to make her aggressive, but to teach her how to feel safe again." Rhett's head snapped up, stunned. "She doesn't hit first," Ms. Caldwell said, voice steady. "She never hits first, but she knows how to end something if she has to." The boardroom shifted. Pity, shock, and dawning understanding rippled across the table. Mr. Carver tried to recover. "That still doesn't explain why," but the principal cut him off. "It explains perfectly." She tapped the paused frame on her tablet, Rhett's hand extended, fingers gripping Neera's hoodie. "This is not provocation from Neera. This is assault." Rhett's jaw clenched until his teeth creaked. "And based on the witness testimony," another board member added, "it's clear your son organized the confrontation." Mrs. Carver's face drained of color. "That can't be. Rhett wouldn't." But Rhett said nothing, because he couldn't deny it. Not anymore. The board exchanged glances. "It is the recommendation of this committee," the principal said, "that Rhett Carver, Sloane Huxley, and Maddox Crane be suspended for their actions and placed under behavioral review." The words struck harder than any punch Neera had thrown. Rhett's pride, his image, his social kingdom, crumbled in front of the people he most wanted to impress, his parents. Mr. Carver slammed a hand on the table. "This is outrageous." But the decision was final. Across the room, Neera remained silent, calm, composed, unreadable. Her silence was no longer a weakness. It was her power, a blow to the ego wounds deeper than any bruise on the skin. But even after justice was served, Neera still had one final message left to deliver. The basketball court behind Westlake High was usually loud after school, shoes squeaking, balls bouncing, laughter echoing across the asphalt. But today, the air was different. Hundreds of students gathered in a half-circle, murmuring, whispering, pulling out phones. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. At the center of the court stood Neera Caldwell, hands in her hoodie pockets, shoulders relaxed, eyes lowered in quiet patience. She didn't shift. She didn't fidget. She simply waited, calm as stone. To her right, Zion lingered near the edge of the crowd, twisting his backpack strap nervously but refusing to leave. Piper stood farther back, arms crossed tightly, guilt carved into her face. Then the murmuring broke, because Rhett Carver, Sloane Huxley, and Maddox Crane stepped onto the court. It was the first time the school had seen Rhett after his suspension notice. No swagger, no smirk, no crowd following him like shadows, just a boy walking with the weight of public consequence pressing his spine down. Whispers rippled across the students. "Is this for real?" "No way they're actually apologizing." "They're gonna kneel?" Sloane swallowed hard, face still bruised. Maddox kept his eyes glued to the ground. Rhett forced himself forward until he stood only a few feet from Neera. For a moment, No one moved. Naira lifted her gaze. Rhett's breath hitched, just a tiny fracture of sound, but enough to reveal fear he could no longer hide. The principal stood off to the side, arms crossed. "Rhett," she said firmly. "Begin." Rhett's fists clenched. His pride clawed at him, desperate to survive, desperate to save face. But the evidence, the witness, the board's decision, everything had stripped him bare. He lowered himself to his knees. The court went silent, utterly, completely silent. Sloane followed, lips trembling. Maddox dropped beside them, wincing as his ribs protested. Before the entire student body, Rhett bowed his head, voice cracking as the words dug themselves out of him. I'm sorry, Naira. I shouldn't have touched you. I shouldn't have done any of it." Sloane's apology was quieter. Maddox's came out in broken pieces, but all three knelt, the kings of Westlake High, dethroned at the feet of the girl they once tried to destroy. Naira didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her chin in triumph. She stepped forward just enough for her shadow to fall across the three boys and said, in a voice soft but strong, "I hope this is the last time someone weaker has to fear you." The words didn't stab. They didn't condemn. They simply told the truth. The kind of truth that lands harder than any punch ever could. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, electric, unforgettable. Students held their breath. Even the breeze stilled, and then, clap. A single sound. Zion. His hands came together again, firmer this time. Then again. The courage in his applause shattered the tension. Another student joined. Then two more. Then a wave. Soon, the entire court thundered with applause. Not for violence, not for drama, but for the strength it took for someone so quiet to stand, survive, and rise above her attackers. Naira didn't bow, didn't wave, didn't cry. She simply turned, stepped through the parted crowd, and walked away in silence. But this time, that silence carried meaning. Not fear, not numbness, not avoidance. It was silence shaped by power, by survival, by victory. And Westlake High would never forget it. And just like that, the hallway legends of Westlake High collapsed under the weight of their own cruelty. The girl they mocked, cornered and underestimated, walked away without raising her voice, while the ones who thought they ruled the school were left kneeling in front of everyone. Power didn't change hands that day. It revealed where it truly belonged. Now I want to hear from you. If you were standing in that restroom, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments, and if this story hit you the way it hit them, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You won't want to miss the next twist.